We don't even realize it, but there are just so many things that control our lives that are totally man-made. At the very tip-top of the list is time. I mean, the sun naturally comes up in the morning, but who determined what 6 a.m. is? How did we decide on how many hours are in a day? In measuring time, shouldn't a second really be a first? The tick and the talk of the truth is that time kind of meandered until time became standard. It's hard to imagine, but there once was a time when time itself was not so accurate. Apparently, it could change from town to town.
Oh, it was absolutely different from town to town. We just travel a few miles east or west, and you would find noon would take place at a different time in each place. But again, if you're not traveling quickly between those places, it's of negligible interest.
That's because for millennia, people could just look up in the sky, see the sun was directly overhead, and know that the day was pretty much half over. I met up with the Henry Ford's chief curator, Marc Greuther, at the train depot in Greenfield Village to learn how time finally became standardized. And yes, I was a skosh late. We take it for granted that time varies from place to place. If it's noon in New York City, it's 9 a.m. in Los Angeles. Was that always the case?
The notion that we've got time zones, and it's kind of, how to put it, quantified for particular areas, that was an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution.
When does the concept of standardized time come in?
It initially emerges in the 1840s in England, and in the United States, it's about 40 years later, it's 1883, when standardized time is introduced. It comes about, though, because of the increased efficiencies of traveling over distance, especially if you're running a railroad. You end up in a situation in the 1880s where Connecticut, there are actually 5 different times being used within Connecticut.
In a tiny little
state. Because of the railroads that were there. And in that period, there were like 50 different times being used across the United States by the various railroads. So if you stayed in a hotel in Boston, you'd have the local time, but then you'd have the local time for New York Central System or whomever.
It sounds like the railroad was really central to the adoption of standardized time.
Absolutely, and it really comes down to the fact that they could collapse distance. It starts becoming much more apparent what the different times are in various places. So that's how that notion of like, okay, 50 is obviously too many times across the nation, but you can't just impose one. So that's when the notion of the zones came up.
Was it necessary to adopt standardized time to have, say, a timetable of national train travel?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And of course it helped there was the Greenwich Meridian as well, so that had already been established.
How was it decided that the Greenwich Meridian would be, I guess, the baseline for standardized time?
It comes down to the research that was being done and the advancements that had been made at the Royal Observatory, which was at Greenwich, which is close to the sea. A lot of this had to do with navigation and timekeeping at seas.
How did this affect life?
So for many people, it was a great advantage. It was about consistency, it was about punctuality, it was about a standard. For other people, it felt like an outrageous imposition on a way of life that had been in place for years. It was almost an example of a kind of big tech company suddenly imposing a standard. So, there was immense resistance in many, many places.
The only thing I can think of that's more important than standardized time is network TV time.
Well, we don't have time to talk about that.
Yeah, I guess we're out.
You got it.